Right, so I'll just get started then. This is a talk on IoT, specifically IoT security, titled From the Living Room to the Boss's Office, which, if you listen to the keynote like Nicolas Boeckh or all, you may have an understanding that it is not a fantastic thing. IoT is quite a complication to the information security threat landscape. So that's why sometimes some people go around and call it the bane of InfoSec. Obligatory introduction slide. Who am I? I am Nicolas Boeckh. I am a Swiss student currently pursuing a master's degree in systems and computer services. Around those are my socials. And so directly kind of going right in, IoT, if you wanted a very long and formal definition of it, you could probably go for this, but we don't care about this. Formality is a little bit, it's academic, right? Let's go with the Internet of Things, that's what it means. And what is it exactly? It's a device or a group of devices that are going to speak to others or to others of the same type, or to systems that are supposed to control them. And is the general definition for it. So think smartwatches, think smart fridges, smartphones, everything with the word smart in front of it, basically, and other additional things. We'll cover that a little bit later. So the current state of IoT in the world is that, depending on who you ask, there's between 17 billion IoT devices and 50 billion IoT devices. The reason for the difference is what people qualify as an IoT device. So if we count every type of different connected device, then it's 50 billion. And that is what we're going to be taking as a benchmark. IoT is kind of everywhere, so I mentioned in automation. It's also used in logistics. It's used in environmental metrics control. It's used in public health. It's kind of, it's pervasively everywhere. And that's something we have to deal with now as an industry. So it also does have a certain technological breadth from your hardware implementation. So whether or not you're going off of your own circuit board to an integrated circuits, or if you're basing yourself off of an STM32 board or an Arduino board or something of the sorts. It does also have a certain transmission technology breadth. So you could also be transmitting using cellular networks, ZigBee, Bluetooth Low Energy, long range RF, RFID, various other types of NFC networks. And so that's something we also have to deal with. Now, there's a fun joke about the state of IoT security. You may have noticed once again in the keynote that there was a meme that went, the S in IoT stands for security. We're not exactly there anymore, but we're also nowhere near to a comprehensive security for IoT. So we've had a few ISO IEC standards pop up recently, as recently as 2020, so last year. ISO IEC 21823-2, for example, speaks about the transport interoperability of IoT systems. So we're at least getting somewhere, right? But there's no one-size-fits-all approach, mostly because IoT devices are there for every type of circumstance. They're used for everything. One of the main aspects of IoT is the interoperability of devices. If you have a device of a specific type, let's say a wireless mouse, and you have a computer or a smart TV, in theory, they should be able to speak to each other without an issue. The problem would be then the interpretation, which would then require a driver. So it's possible, and they can communicate. The interpretation and the communication might be a little problematic. One of the things that is used, for example, in Bluetooth is the Bluetooth GATT scheme, which is the generic attribute scheme, where it divides your basically communications into services, and these services are then divided in characteristics. And it's kind of a push-pull subscribe methodology. You could subscribe to a characteristic and then you update it every time that that characteristic gets a new value. So that's one of the things. Now, one of the core problems in IoT is sometimes the human is left out of the equation. So how do we make decisions in IoT, more accurately, how do IoT devices make decisions for us? Well, there's the usual if this then that kind of methodology, where, you know, if something happened, then have an array of consequences. That's pretty much how it works. There's the human touch, which is, you know, when people, which may or may not be the people being affected by these IoT devices, actually press a button and make the devices do something. And then there's the very not at all niche and over-talked concept of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which, yeah, it's there. I'm not going to talk about it because it's not my field of interest or expertise. So what are we going to be talking about in summary? We're going to be seeing the breadth of IoT in the wild, how hard it is to be a baddie, and then basically the three-letter agency recommendations on IoT security. And we'll see how those recommendations are a little bit wonky on the end. So yeah, starting off with breadth of IoT in the wild. So we're going to be going over various concepts of, let's say, IoT deployments, but it's not just one device, it's a fleet of devices of different types that are interacting, and we're basically going to go over these various interactions and how they work. So one of the examples would be home automation. Like I mentioned earlier, you have a range of IoT devices, IoT-enabled devices in homes, right? Such as thermostats, an oven, for example, if you're a bit crazy, shutters, doorbell cameras, door locks, your air conditioning unit, a fireplace, all those kinds of things. And you also have IoT and physical security systems, such as surveillance systems that surveil the security of vulnerable buildings. You also have various monitoring systems. You have access control systems. For example, once again, surveillance cameras, you have tourniquets, you have badge readers, you have, once again, access control policies. And all of these things can be programmed and interconnected in such a way that it isn't at the level of the device that the decision is being made. Another interesting usage for IoT would be environment control. And by environment control, I'm not meaning controlling an environment, but controlling the values coming out of an environment. For example, making certain you don't die of carbon monoxide poisoning. So imagine a carbon monoxide detector which has the ability to start your AC should the carbon monoxide levels be too high, or just send you an alert. That would be a pretty interesting application for that. What other applications we have for this? We would have, okay, so we saw carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, ozone, NO3, greenhouse gases, water pollutants. We can kind of use them everywhere. A lot of IoT systems kind of were injected in sewers recently with the height of COVID, because there was an attempt to maybe see if, excrement could give an idea of whether or not a certain amount of population had a higher amount of COVID rates. And if we could see that as an excrement. So that's maybe not the nicest description or the nicest thing that could happen, but it's one of the things we can talk about. Other settings would be industrial settings. For example, using a distributed control system to control, observe, and report on various things happening in an industrial site. We would also have, an industrial site could have factory arms, could have, let's say, vehicles, could have robots. The main idea is also to keep the human safe, usually. And so all these devices should, first of all, not auto-destruct, but second of all, not hurt other people. That's a pretty important point. One interesting part of IoT, which everyone talks about it in IoT talk, is teledildonics. So if you do not know what teledildonics means, it's a portmanteau of the word dildo, which you all know what a dildo is, and the word tilling, which means from a distance. So yeah, it's remote controlled sexual devices. So that reference was from the contest partners. They had a pretty fun article about a chastity gauge that they just overwrote, and how that could, be a problem to the people in them. So yeah, exposure to the individual's body parts. That's pretty much interesting. And yeah, so these devices might make you COVID safe. That's pretty much where there was a big boom in the industry, was during COVID. But yeah, you might be catching another viral load. Other usages would be medical IoT. Yeah, so one of the risks, of course, would be death, depending on the IoT device. So I didn't put the reference in here, but there is someone who hacked their own pacemaker. Imagine someone else hacking their pacemaker and it could die, potentially. You have medical IoT devices for monitoring. For example, monitoring someone's vital signs, how often they move, how much energy they're spitting out, how their breathing is. But you could also do this from a distance. Like instead of having someone under observation at the hospital, you have someone being at home, being monitored via an IoT device. So that's pretty, that actually liberates some hospital beds, which is always nice, especially in the current conditions. So yeah, we could talk about sleep monitoring devices, vital sign monitoring devices, temperature monitoring devices, all those kinds of things. And also pacemakers and insulin pumps, because that's kind of where it becomes a little bit crazy. So yeah, discussing IoT devices that interconnect in various settings. I kind of want to touch base on maybe home automation ecosystems and industrial automation ecosystems, because although they are absolutely dissimilar, they actually have a lot of resemblances in how they interact with the world. So I'm going to look at that. Home automation ecosystems, yeah. So, but everything kind of starts with an IoT hub, right? You usually have an IoT hub. Either it's one IoT device connected to your phone, which then goes via either an IoT hub that is outside of your network, or it's one that's inside of your network. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. So here it's an IoT hub that's inside your network, which can connect to your phone, right? So far, so good. And let's say that in your home, you collect solar energy because you want to pay less for your electricity. Well, you would have a solar panel potentially attached to a smart meter. Both of these could send information to the IoT hub. So how much energy am I producing? How much energy am I consuming? Another thing could be a thermostat, which controls the AC. Both of these things can have values that are sent to the IoT hub, such as, hey, what's the temperature? What's the air pressure? What's the humidity? And then the AC, yeah, we cycle this much air, or we cool down the temperature by this much. And that allows people that are a little bit stringent and or maybe curious to make a ton of math or just see how it's going at their house. Another thing could be potentially air filtration systems, filtration units, which, something fun. Another concept would be, for example, if you use a geolocation type system on your phone that is linked to your IoT hub, could be, hey, I haven't been home for the last 2 days. I'm in another country. Maybe stop turning on the water boiler every night. That way you conserve energy and the environment. Always nice. Other systems and home automation ecosystems you would have potentially. So once again, an IoT hub, which then links to a router, which at some point links to the internet. That's that nice dotted red bar. And let's say that you have devices on your network, such as, let's say, motion sensor or surveillance So if you're on your local network, right, you potentially have a device that allows you to view the camera's feeds. So it could either be a camera, computer with the relevant software, could be an actual camera, rig. It could be a ton of things. But what happens when you have like a detection? Right? Yeah, you have something that's detected, and at some point you want to alert the user, right? Because hey, it's either the mailman, or it's robbers, or it's kidnappers, or it's people wanting to shoot you down in the middle of the night. I'm trying to make this talk as international as possible, but this doesn't really happen on maybe not on our side of the pond. So what could you do with this idea? Well, this is a bit of an if this then that situation. You could do something that could deter one of the burglars or intruders or postmen. So usually for a postman, you'd have a dog, right? But no, there you could just turn on the lights or turn on the radio, turn on the TV or things like that to give the potential intruder the impression that there's someone there. And on the other end, you could also have like a cloud storage or a local storage for footage so that you could get back to it. Let's say to maybe give the cops some footage, or give yourself some footage. Like, oh, someone backed into my car. This is the person, this is their license plate. I can go and say, hey, there's this issue. So yeah, there's that. And from your phone, you would be able to use this footage on your cloud storage device or your local storage device, in theory. Similar system with a router, except the IoT hub is on the outside of your network. So there, the internet, you have an IoT hub on the other side. So you have all your devices, they all communicate with the IoT hub, and the decisions are made outside of your local network. So yeah, you can get the feeds of your camera, your detection system, and hey, if there's a detection, you send an alert, same way as usual, and you use some deterrents, same thing as before, except IoT hub is on the outside. And one of the good things with that is that it's easier to have your cloud storage on the outside as well, which some people like to have. I don't really do these types of surveillance systems, but yeah. Another type of home automation that can be done is a location-based automation. For example, let's say this is a map of Geneva, so Geneva is where I live. This is where I fictitiously live. This is not where I actually live. This is where I work, maybe, and this is a shop. So yeah, red is a shop, purple is where I work, and orange is where I live. Let's say that I'm leaving home. So I'm exiting a radius around my home. One thing that could be done would be me having a smart oven hooked up to my router, right? And my router for the internet to the IoT hub, right? Hey, I've left that server because my geolocation app said so. Well, maybe it would be a good idea if I informed my home network that, hey, maybe just force the oven to be off, just to be safe. Pretty interesting. Similar problem is, hey, I'm at work and I'm leaving. So same thing with the smart oven, right? Connected to the internet, connected to an IoT hub, same as before. Well, let's say that this evening I want to eat turkey or chicken or pizza, I don't know, something. And that requires the oven to be on or at least preheated. Now, I know it's going to take me about 40 minutes to get from work to home. So I could, from my phone, say, hey, preheat the oven. That could be interesting. That's also one of the use cases for this. So yeah, preheat. Another would be, okay, yeah, I'm in the vicinity of a shop I usually go to, and I know what articles are at that shop. A router and a smart fridge. Who doesn't love a smart fridge, right? They know exactly what you need. Connected to the internet as usual, IoT hub as usual, hey, location. What's missing in the fridge? Did I forget any eggs? Did I drink too much orange juice? Things like that. And hey, it gives you a list, and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot this, and I need to buy that. And that could be a usage. Now, of course, nothing needs a conventional list on a piece of paper that you then lose, but it's a use case at least. Another use case would be then more in the industrial construction sector. Let's say you have a few devices, let's say in this case excavators, right? Then you have a few trucks because you need to move the stuff that you excavate somewhere else, which is where you use those trucks. Well, let's say you have a system for fleet management. Guys, hey, what is IoT for then to optimize a few processes, right? Ideally. So you also have some people, which is not on a construction site. You would assume there to be people working. So you have a form of hub that also deals with human and material logistics. How many people do I have? How many people do I have to pay? How many hours are being done? Who can I assign where to do what task, depending on what their job is? Are they electricians, or are they plumbers, or are they heating experts? Things like that. And also, what materials do they need? 50 50 tons of cement? Do they need 20 tons of rebar? No, well, who knows? But that IoT would potentially be an answer to that. Now, of course, you would have some form of local management that could potentially prioritize various tasks. That's an option. Then re-trigger some app, right? And those two would also communicate because, hey, you might need a worker to drive an excavator. That makes a ton of sense. And an excavator, you need to be able to track when it breaks so that you can send it to a shop, things like that. There's a lot of things you can do. The problem isn't so far in the things you can do, but in how it's presented and how you can do them. So, of course, one usage of such technology would be analytics, because who doesn't want a bit of analytics? Well, the big boss person might. So analytics are farmed from all that you're doing. Hey, we spent this much, gas on excavators. Hey, we had this many people go on sick. Hey, there's this, and all of this data could then go to someone higher up the food chain. That's a usage, and it's usually those people that are going to start the procedures to implement these networks because someone sold them all. So they're getting the full benefit of it, and other people might get less benefit from it. Another thing that's pretty fun on construction sites that has been kind of getting in place the last 2 or 3 years is augmented reality. For example, a worker carries augmented reality glasses, and they're digging the tunnel, right? And while digging this tunnel, instead of hitting, let's say, a water pipe or something because they dug in 10 inches too deep or something, well, they have a layout, an augmented reality layout of the piping that is starting to exist now. Maybe it didn't exist 10 years ago, but it's starting to exist now. And that's at least some of the, let's say, more interesting uses for it, at least from the worker side. It could also be like, hey, there's these electrical networks, or this is the setup for the electrical networks. Or hey, we've seen this thing move since yesterday, random things like that. Could be an inventory system as well. Like, the uses are endless. How we use them, that's another problem. So now we're going to get a bit into how to be a baddie, at least in IoT. Not exactly how to compromise devices, but the technologies that are there that are, let's say, vulnerable to compromise most of the time. So one of your attack vectors would be, at least on the hardware side, would be your integrated circuit protocol. So I2C, that's a communication protocol between all your various components, right? One of the fun things you can do with this is compromise the ACK values, which then drops what's going on the SCL line. One of the things you can do with that is you can trick a device not to respond, or intercept the response, or do something with the response, and then the movement will continue. For example, let's say you have some machinery, robot, right? And it's dependent on the ACK to say, hey, I did a cycle of moving, then the motor has moved, that's fine. Now I'm going to stop moving, or I'm going to start moving again, but like on cycle 2. Compromising the ACK would mean, hey, I haven't stopped moving, and the arm continues moving. And that could potentially overextend the arm. It could, various things that you could do with a robot, or let's say anything that uses an engine, that's software hardware controlled for that. One of the consequences would be machinery damage. That's a perfectly viable consequence. Another vector would be the serial peripheral interface, so SPLN, right? Where you could read the clock speed and the data stream. So if you're sending data from one device to another, let's say, I don't know, a pacemaker, right? So you have one component in the pacemaker that's sending data to another component in your pacemaker. So let's say the thing that reads your electrical cardiogram, or your electrical rhythm, right? And you want to sabotage that, so in order to make the device induce a shock. Well, one of the things you could do is say, hey, I'm getting this, and I'm going to attach a new device to then inject some new things. Of course, on a pacemaker, it's not really feasible because you need to kind of have access to the pacemaker, but you could compromise it ahead of schedule before it's implemented. You could do various things like that. One of the other things you can do, however, is get some information leakage. So from devices that are communicating, let's say you have various sensors on a device, those devices pool some data in your main hub, basically, and that's sending into a common communications component, let's say a Bluetooth energy component. But if you can, let's say, intercept the feed at that moment, you know all the data that is going to be sent. You can also potentially extract the firmware of the device. Another compromise vector or attack vector would be the UART chips. So universal synchronous receiver transmit. It's basically a hardware communication protocol from a device to a device. And most of the time what's going to happen is you have two devices that present the same ports and they will communicate to each other. And that's, using UART protocols. And there you can, intercept the communication. And if you're being very, 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 very lucky, and you're attacking something that actually has a Linux system on it, you could potentially call a shell. That's one of the things you could do potentially on a router. That's one of the examples cited here. So popping a shell on a router. What could be easier? Of course, most of these things require you to have physical access. Hey, we're talking about hardware. So it would usually be something you do in order to, let's say, find the firmware, find out where the device is calling home to, things like that. So, however, other things that are being used, as an attack vector would be as communications. So Bluetooth. So you could, abuse the generic attribute profile, generic access profile, or the generic attribute system. So you could potentially, rewrite on any characteristic. So a characteristic, like I mentioned earlier, is, let's say, a segment of your entire band, which is then reserved for push-pull updates, or just pull updates, or notifications, or things like that. Right? And one of the things you can see here is the kind of partners compromising a 360 smart lock with a replay attack. So they identify what is being sent, and then they just resend it to log. It's still unlocked. So it's things like that. And so what can you do with that? You can leak some information. Of course, a lot of things go over Bluetooth nowadays. Too many things go over Bluetooth nowadays. You can potentially bluejack some, an exchange. Impersonate one of the members of the exchange. And all of this is due to a lack of, not understanding, but of implementation of various systems or procedures or things that you can do with Bluetooth, such as secure pairing. There exists a way to do it, just very few devices actually do it. Well, it's getting better, but it's been getting better gradually, right? Another attack vector would be the endpoint. Let's say your device is connecting to a phone, and the phone is contacting an endpoint to download the firmware update. Well, you could probably enumerate the endpoint, the usual, things you can do with an endpoint. But you can also find some binaries, like I mentioned before, the error updates. So SNCL, once again, at DEFCON 27, they managed to download the binaries for the app that would then connect to a dongle that would then connect to a butt plug. Well, the app would then download the firmware for setup. So it was then able to decompile it there. So yeah, careful with your binaries, I guess. So what are the possible consequences of that? Well, you can spy on people if you have access to their cameras, right? You can set up botnets. That's actually one of the things that happens the most frequently nowadays. It's less about compromising the network itself than having a staging area for a botnet, or having X devices be a part of a botnet. It's, yeah. You can also have some prevention leakage, like prevention, impersonate a device or impersonate a person. You can do some network acrobatics or pivot off an IoT device into another device that will be connected to it. Imagine a Bluetooth dongle on a computer. Depending on what type of Bluetooth dongle it is and how it communicates with the computer, you could potentially gain access to the computer. Maybe. You could potentially gain physical ingress into a place. Like if you manage to compromise a smart lock reader, an RFID badge reader, things like that. Now I'm going to go a little bit over a few examples that happened in history already. For example, the Hickory deadbolt. It's a deadbolt that you put on a door, and basically you could compromise that deadbolt via the mobile app because it was storing the credentials in an unencrypted database on the phone. So yeah, the Ethernet bridge that would bridge, your deadbolt to your network was also communicating, the MQTT in an unencrypted fashion, so you would have credential leakage, and it also had debug logging enabled on the app. So it was logging all of the failures, all of the things that it was doing. You could extract the logs and then find the credentials again. Right. Moving on to everyone's favorite company, Amazon. That's a joke. The Ring doorbell. An attacker who was already on the network could potentially view video and audio footage. And of course, attackers being on the network is already bad. So you're already pretty much screwed. Imagine you have a physical piece of something that is valuable, say money, gold, anything, and you have it in a safe. Well, what better way than a smart, doorbell to see your comings and goings? And so when you come, just browse the place. So for ways, surveillance, impersonation, tracking when people come and go. Another thing would be kids, children. Yeah. The Leapfrog tablets were using an in-house app to communicate between Leapfrog devices. That sounds fantastic. Until you realize that they were doing this by having the device be basically a small Wi-Fi router with a constant Wi-Fi SSID, which was headchat. And you could basically track them using Wiggle or other services, not in real time, but you can still find, hey, here's a person with that device. And also another thing you could do is you could basically put yourself in there and send messages, which were pre-programmed messages to children. But one of those pre-programmed messages was, hey, meet me outside. Which, needless to say, if you're a child and you get that and it's coming from a trusted source, you're going to do. And if that trusted source is a kidnapper or something else, it is no way to. Another example would be a child tracking watch. Hey, an IoT watch to track my child, what could go wrong? So that's one of the one use case for an IoT watch, right? Watch that requires registration, so you register your watch to your account, everything's fantastic. And what happens is when you go and query the status or location of that watch, what it does is it does a request to a server and says, hey, I have this, I need to send me the location back. And okay, that sounds fine. Until you realize, or the researchers realize, that they could just change the ID. And since they were logged in as a registered person, they could also get the location for potentially tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of other children, which is not good at all. So yeah, that's a case of sufficient. Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. So I kind of said that at the beginning, spoiled it a bit, that the three-letter agencies did recommendations. Well, yeah. So first of all, who are the three-letter agencies that we're talking about? Let's start with the one that doesn't have three letters, NISA. It's the EU Cybersecurity Agency. It's an organism that publishes recommendations pretty actively. It's been active since 2005 and hosts forums and conferences on security. An actual three-letter agency would be the NSA, the US National Security Agency. They're everyone's friends. They also publish recommendations. There was the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency publish recommendations, and they try to be the glue between infrastructure corporations and individuals or corporations in cybersecurity. It kind of works. We hope. A few honorable mentions could be MITRE. So they manage federally funded research and development centers to support various US government agencies. There's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where they kind of propose standards, which do include cybersecurity standards. In the UK, there's the Information Commissioner's Office. They are an independent regulatory office to ensure national data protection. And in France, French, there's the Commission nationale de l'informatique et des libertés, which is a French administrative regulatory body kind of who ensures that data privacy laws are respected. So, top 5 recommendations. That's kind of something that makes your IoT team say, oh yeah, we live in a society, or IoT dev teams say, we live in a society. And sadly enough, the number for emergency services in that society would be 011899988199991197253, which is a reference, and if you didn't get it, go watch the IT project. One of those recommendations would be the frequent security testing. So, it's an aspect of security by design. It's one of those very modern things included in the shift left mentality, which is putting security, not in the last phases of development, but more during the requirements phases, which is very good. And it's one of the things to consider when we recommend frequent security testing is that it's not always the same company and person that is supposed to do these tests. It's you need to consider diversity and externalization of the security value, because otherwise people might get cozy in doing the exact same tests and getting the same exact amount of money at the end without testing anything actually new. So yeah, that's a thing. Security and storage, transit, and kind of in math. So in the calculations we're going to do, it's to avoid using custom and proprietary solutions, but rather relying on community and scientifically verified solutions. Using encryption in transit and at rest for critical data. So, for example, transport layer security with perfect forward secrecy would be one of the recommendations. Having a certain signature for content and verifying that the signature matches at the end, very important. And then using unique keys for any type of exchanges. On the hardware, firmware, software side, over-the-air update capability. Just make your device updatable, please. Having hardware that's specifically there for security, such as components that are going to enable you to have a hardware proof of trust at boot. It's quite important. Automatic firmware updates should be an option, and those updates should be backwards compatible. Because hey, you don't want to break a device by updating it, right? And once again, code signing, because signing your code could allow you to avoid the code being tampered with. Another aspect would be the secure by default aspect. So top 5 recommendations for cybersecurity: be secure. I know it's a bit ridiculous. One of those concepts would be the principle of least privilege. So all your users can do the minimum possible to do whatever they're going to do. All your processes follow the same rules. They only have the amount of access they need to the things they do. Having device passwords that have individual passwords, such as not being a smart TV with a password that is 11112222 as a default root password that existed. I don't remember the company, but it's just as good. I don't remember the name of the company. If you have default passwords, make them have to be changed. And then, also enable MFA and, strong passwords, things like that. And last recommendation would be live every day as if you're going to be audited next. So record everything, preserve logs on some form of durable storage, have monitoring periods where you're going to monitor, what's going on to determine when there's something going not right. And then perform regular audits, even if it's not an audit from another company or you're being audited by something else, do your own audits. And then also other audits, of course. And also perform penetration tests. So as I'm closing in on time, what are the conclusions? So one of the things that I did say is that this would be from the, from home to the boss's office. Except I haven't talked at all about the boss's office. And why is that? Is because it's always the same issues. Whether you're at home or at the boss's office, the only thing that is going to change is the environment in which these devices are placed. If the device itself is vulnerable, but it's incorporated in an environment that is, let's say, shielding itself from all the IoT devices on it, or that is, segregating them, then the devices might have the same issues, but they're not going to be exploitable the same way. All these recommendations have limitations because not everyone that is an IoT company can actually deal with doing all the recommendations. I mean, to be frank, the nice recommendations for IoT cybersecurity, there's about 47 pages, and that's in very small font, and there's about 100 of them. So yeah, a little bit complicated. There's a huge volume of IoT devices out there, just hilariously huge, and they're also very cheap, which means that it's actually quite easier to just ship out a new device with a new patch and say, hey, buy this one instead. Right. So yeah, this talk is under CC by SA, so just use it whenever. And yeah, reach me anywhere here. I have made it on time. Yay.